in 3, 2, 1. It's an opportunity to sit down and talk with someone who's always smiling, who's very smart, and who also has an opportunity to talk about something that's on the top of most of our minds, policing in America. Please welcome to our discussion today, the Chief of Police in San Jose, California, Eddie Garcia, otherwise known as Eddie. Eddie, how are you today?
I'm doing well, Bob. Thanks for having me.
It's always good to have you on board, and I know this is going to be a fun talk, because you know me, I like to talk. We'll try not to keep you talking too long.
Okay.
I'd like everybody to understand your background first. You're talking to a diversity in media class, students from all over the Bay Area, different cultures. Tell us about your background and why you wanted to be a police officer.
Well, my background, I was born in San Juan, Puerto Rico in 1970, probably a very long time before your students were born. I actually
Not me,
moved.
though.
Well, I'm sorry?
Not me. I was around at that time, but go ahead.
So I said students. I was careful. So I was born in San Juan, Puerto Rico, moved to San Jose, actually came right to San Jose. I was very young, 5 years old when I moved. Didn't know how to speak English. Actually, none of my family did it. At the time, it was my mother, my father, my sister, and myself. We moved in with another family in an apartment, in a small apartment near Cropley and Murrill.
Wow.
And started learning English in San Jose. It was important to me always, to work in the city that I came from and learn how to speak English here. And, we were raised, Catholic, church every Sunday, with everything going on. There's one point in our lives where as we were learning English and we were struggling a little bit in school, learning the language, that my mom actually spoke to a teacher and asked the teacher, "Hey, how are my kids doing?" In broken English. My mom is my superhero, and I'll explain why in a little bit. But she probably has as heavy an accent today as she had in 1975, 77. Love my mom. She's, like I said, my superhero, and I'll explain that in a bit. But anyway, the teacher responded to my mom, and she told him, "Hey, they'll never be at the head of their class, but they'll do okay." And so that resonated with me so much. So when I got appointed chief and I was at City Hall and I was giving my acceptance speech, and I turned to my mom and I go, "Mom, I think we made it to the top of our class," which was actually pretty cool. But my father left us short time later. I was 11 years old when he left the family. He was a truck driver and went off on a trip and just never came home.
Really?
Didn't talk to my mother, my sister, or I for years. He tried to reach out several years, probably about 5, 6 years later. So I always say I was raised by a single mom. We were homeless for a while. We lost a house. We were going to hotels all the time for a little bit. And I'll never forget, this is where I sometimes get emotional talking about my mom, but we would be going, I'll never forget, we'd be going into a hotel room and she'd be carrying an iron with her. And this was the pride that my mom had, because maybe we didn't have a house, but there was no way that woman was going to send her kids to school in wrinkled clothes. That is what her mindset was. Always put us first. Went through all the hardships, never asked for help, never tried to recontact my father, just wanted to do it all on her own. Great woman of faith. And again, really, we talk about superheroes. My superhero is a 78-year-old Puerto Rican woman that lives in South San Jose. And so when it became time to figure out what I wanted to do, I wanted to help people. It was exciting to be a police officer. I bought into every day is different. And at the time in the early 90s, being a bilingual individual with a very clean past, at that time in the early 90s, there was a really, really there was a real need for bilingual individuals in public safety, both police and fire.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was 20 years old. There's 3 organizations that I was going to apply to. It was going to be the CHP, the LAPD, and the SJPD. And I decided just to apply to one. At the time, I had a lot of friends that would basically shotgun applications to like 10 different agencies, and whoever hired them first went. But to me, I was 20 and a half, and I said, you know what, I'm going to apply where I want to go. And You know, I turned 21 in December, and my academy started in February of 1992. You know, I always said I wanted to be a police officer for San Jose because it didn't matter where you were from in such a diverse city. If you were a stranger here, I'll understand because I was there. And you know, that's the long and short of probably longer than you want to hear.
Well, it's more.
What my background and why I chose the San Jose PD.
Well, it's more than I thought I would get, but I loved it. I thought it was great. You have been in the police here in San Jose for 28 years, as I understand it.
Nearly 29 years.
All right, very good. You've been chief of police for 4 years.
I'm in my fifth. It'll be almost 5 years. 4.5 years. It'll be 5 years when I retire.
All right, very good. Let's fast forward now to the year 2020, which we're all in recording this. We just experienced one of the most remarkable years, and it keeps going. Starting out with COVID-19, then we had what happened in Minneapolis with George Floyd, followed by protests all over the country that continue to late August as we do this recording. You're right at the epicenter, because right now people are saying the police don't get people of color. I look at you and I'm like, how is that not possible? How do you react to that?
Well, you know what? We need to understand our past. You know, we need to understand that we were born with original sin. When I say original sin is, you know, I became a police officer in '92, and I certainly wasn't responsible for some of the atrocities that we need to admit that American law enforcement has done in our communities, particularly against our communities of color. You know, one of the things that we started in San Jose like a year and a half ago was a history of American law enforcement, the negative history that American law enforcement's had on our communities of color, so that my recruits coming out of the academy understand that in certain parts of San Jose, you need to work harder for trust, that just walking in with your uniform does not give you trust. I'll give you a story about my mother once. So my mom was always very, a police officer would walk in the room, and I told this story one day to a group of people. And I said, listen, my mom, and I explained to my mom, when a police officer walked in the room, my mom would literally stand at attention when they walked in. And there was somebody not of color that said, well, see, your mom had respect in the police, so that's why you did it. So they can't say people of color don't. And I go, no, there's a difference. My mom was fearful of the police. I don't know if respect went anywhere in there, but she was fearful. There's a difference. And we don't want that. And we need to understand that. And so, you know, regardless the color of our skin, oftentimes we understand that people see the uniform first and the color of our skin second. And so oftentimes when I hear that, I understand I'm a police officer, okay? But when I try to tell people as well, I'm Puerto Rican first. I'm a police officer second. And those things meld together at some point. And so my experiences growing up has helped mold a lot of the policies that we do here. I'll say it gets frustrating from time to time, because in these last 4.5 years, we have instituted initiatives in this police department that, you know, that no one asked us to do, whether it's a use of force platform to be transparent, whether it's this history in American policing that I just explained to you, whether it's the policies and use of force that we've done. I instituted a religious exemption policy so that we could have a diverse workforce. You know, we just raised the LGBTQ flag for our community and our rank and file in light of it being Pride Month here in San Jose and Silicon Valley. We've done these things. And what's troublesome is really the old adage of what have you done for me lately? It really comes up, because it seems that we're being defined by these last 3 months in the principle of recency without taking a deep breath to look at the vast array of initiatives and ways that we move forward. You know, one of the major things, especially as we're talking about use of force, is when I started working with Police Strategies LLC to study our use of force and to then build a platform that the community could see, the disparity in use of force when we started in 2016 was virtually nothing, meaning we didn't necessarily use force more or less regardless of race. And that was what came out. But African Americans and Latinos were still a little bit more likely to have force used against them than whites. You fast forward 4 years later, we just currently did the report in 2019, It completely switched. Actually, now in 2019, African Americans and Latinos are actually less likely to have force used against them in an arrest situation than whites.
Hmm.
And that didn't happen by accident. That didn't happen by accident, whether it's the procedural justice training that we instituted, the crisis intervention training that I mandated for the entire department, the bias-based policing classes that we give, the history policing, the diversity of the department, the use of force continuum that we use and how we hold officers accountable. That didn't happen by accident. And it seems many times that it's glossed over in favor of the negativity instead of stopping and looking at what's happening. And the frustrating part about it is that we don't get a lot of help from the local media who know what we've done because they're the ones that have run the stories. And I would have hoped that in light of what we were going through, particularly after the murder of George Floyd, which I condemned almost immediately as one of the first major chiefs in the country to condemn it on social media, I would have hoped that we would at least have an opportunity to at least speak truth to, yes, we have a lot more work to do. We are not done. We will never get to the goal line. We are not perfect. We are an imperfect profession and we need to get better. But particularly in this department, we have moved the needle. And I don't feel that we've gotten a very fair representation of that publicly.
Well, I promise you we'll come back to that point because I want to hear more about that. But I want to unpack some of the things you said. You said your mother was afraid of the police. I'd like you to articulate and tell us why you think that was true, if you sense that. I know in the African American community, we were. My parents were, and I had to have that sit-down conversation about, Black children have to be careful. And if you get pulled over, you say, yes, sir, no, sir, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to talk about that. You also, I'm a good Catholic boy too, as you can see in the back.
Yes, I can see that. I saw that the first time we spoke.
And I'm going to scold you right away. They taught us to say, no, God first, then our culture and family, then our business. So the church is watching and saying, hey, what's going on with him? But that's all right. You're allowed. And then we'll get back to the media and some of the things we saw since George Floyd. But talk about your mother's fear first. What was that all about as you were growing up?
Well, it wasn't necessarily as I was growing up. We had some instances in San Jose that really, I'll never forget this. My mom and I joke around a lot is the fact that she's the only Garcia that's ever gotten a ticket for traffic. Until this day, she argues with me that it wasn't her fault, that the police officer didn't understand, he was wrong. And I think it was more, the fear was more of the fact that I don't think she felt that she had a voice. Because as you recall, in San Jose, in the mid-'70s, this was not the most diverse police department in the country.
Correct. That's true.
There were a lot of individuals that are responsible for the fact that the San Jose Police Department has become diverse, that led initiatives, that had lawsuits, that had consent decrees to make this department more diverse, which is exactly why we're diverse. And so that the Mrs. Garcias of the world can have some cultural connection to their police officers so that that fear doesn't exist. Because if you don't feel you have a voice, if you don't feel that you're going to be treated fairly because you feel either one, no one understands you, or two, I look at these officers and no one looks like me, that creates fear. And I think that's what my mom had. Now listen, my mom is also very respectful of the laws of wherever she's at. She really is. And so I don't want to necessarily say that she was fearful of the uniform, just more fearful of the fact that she didn't think she'd be understood. And that's what I think it was based on.
All right, very good. She sounds a lot like my mother, and someday we'll talk about what those combinations can mean for your life. But tying it into what happened in 2020 with George Floyd, as a human being, can you describe how you felt, not how the media portrayed the police reaction, but how you as a person felt?
Let me just say that there isn't a police officer in this police department, and well, maybe there's one, but I will tell you, not many people can say that Eddie Garcia does not support his men and women that put their lives on the line. I will support them when they're right, they're right. When they're wrong, they're wrong. But, regardless, when they're right, regardless of the noise, of the outside noise, I go by facts, and I'll defend my men and women for doing a great job when they do it correctly. And so there's not a lot of people that would say that, oh, that I roll over for politics or what have you. That's not me. I've maybe made a lot of mistakes while I was chief here. That's not one of them. And I think they know that. Having said that, I call out misconduct when I see it, and I was appalled by it, to be honest with you, especially in 2020. Like, I just didn't understand, like, did people not understand the moment that we've been in? We've been dealing with, with so many things. We started our initiatives in 2016, after during the time that Colin Kaepernick began taking a knee, and it almost seemed like, that people just didn't recognize the real issues that were occurring. And so when I saw that, I thought to myself, like, I always say use of force is never pretty. And oftentimes I say, okay, I need to see the entire clip to see what happened. But in this particular instance, I've been a police officer now for 30 years. And when that officer had his knee on his neck, I just sat and I go, he's going to take it off any minute, any second. Okay, he's going to take it off after this minute. Okay, he's surely going to take it off after the guy stopped moving. I mean, it was, I couldn't believe what I saw, which is why, and oftentimes in this line of work, other agencies don't like to be called out by other agencies, but there was no way that I was going to remain silent on such an atrocious incident that I saw, when if I would have seen the same thing happen in another state, and if one of my brother and sister law enforcement officers was the victim, I would have been just as vocal at that. And so, that's the way I felt. I didn't do it because I wanted to be credible. I did it because that's just who I am. And so I knew that second we went back 20, 30 years. I knew the second we saw that, we're going back 20, 30 years. I got on in 1992, right? The Rodney King occurred in 91. The acquittals were in 92. I remember what happened then. And I said to myself, we've had a lot of incidents that have happened since 2016, right? From Ferguson to other incidents. But I saw this, and I just said, to me, this is worse than any of the ones that I've seen recently. Not to say the ones that happened in the last 4 or 5 years weren't atrocious, but I saw this one and I said, this one's going to really, really get bad. And the biggest part, I said, and we're all going to pay for it. And when I'm meaning all, I said all of law enforcement is going to be affected by this. And I just knew it. I knew it was coming. And so it was just really, it was just a feeling of being anxious of, like, when it's going to start. Because what I say all this time is, people don't look at my patch, they look at my badge, and we all have that. And so it was a lot of emotions were flying around. And, that day that I saw the video, I actually went to my academy. I had 50 recruits in the academy. I played the video and I explained to them, this is not what we do. This is not what we're about. If you have that in your heart, I don't want you here. I had Pastor Jason Reynolds with me that gave the same message. I said, listen, and this is one of the biggest things. I said, it doesn't matter how you're trained. Everybody's made this about training. Not everybody, but a lot of people have made it about training. No, it's not. It's about what's in your heart. I could train you to not use a certain force, but if in your heart, you're just a racist, vicious, sadistic individual, it doesn't matter how you're trained. It matters what's in your heart. So training has very little to, not want to say very little, but training is just a part of us becoming better. We have to get better at hiring from the human race, and that's not easy. And so all those emotions went through.
Your points are well taken, and I have to ask this question. Why don't more police officers around the country, your force as well as around the country, talk like you just did, with a sense of humanity about the moment? You saw what we saw, and we were outraged on the human level. And yet I've been appalled by the number of police forces in Atlanta and other places, not to mention Minneapolis, that simply wanted to talk about their training and by the book and no comment. And the police unions, we have to get into those someday, the police unions basically going silent right after the incident. It was noticeable to me and millions of other people. That's when they should have been speaking, like you just did. Why do you think they didn't?
Well, I'll say this, and I can only speak for my union. San Francisco Police Union, our San Jose Police Officers Union, and the LAPD's union all actually did come out vocally and wrote an editorial denouncing what happened. And so I was very proud of them for doing that. I think, a part of it is, I think a part of it is a culture issue. To be frank, I think people want to hide behind the fact that, this individual committed a crime. And so we're going to investigate if the force used was proper. Let's go through the right steps to figure out that these officers get a fair trial and due process, et cetera, et cetera. And I think people are afraid to be ostracized. I think that's part of the culture that actually needs to get fixed. That's why we instituted, I know many other agencies that did as well, instituted a policy, a reporting policy that if officers, and an intervening policy, that not only do officers have to intervene if they see excessive force, but they have to report it as well. And we have to push that culture. We have to push that culture that it's okay if someone did something wrong for you to, stop them or tell someone about it. And so we just have to work towards that more. But yeah, to your point, it's a struggle at times for police chiefs and countries to talk openly and honestly. I mean, I do it because it was pretty obvious. And again, I do it because, as I told you before, I have defended my officers when there's been a lot of noise not to, because I know they did right. So I'm not going to sit and say when I see wrong that I'm not going to call that out, because guess what happens? My credibility does take a hit when I defend my officers for doing right, when I don't call out the wrong. So I'd like to think more police chiefs, I'd see, there's been a lot of my major police chief colleagues. I know Michael Moore, Art Azevedo, Michael Moore from LAPD, Art Azevedo from the Houston Police Department, and many others came also forward to denounce what occurred. And we need to do that more, because that's what's going to build trust in our communities. The one thing that I always hear in our communities, I remember a few years back, I got invited by the 49ers to actually come talk to a group. And although Colin Kaepernick wasn't there, Eric Reed was in the group. And I'll never forget the question Eric Reed asked me, I know Colin Kaepernick gets the front headlines on the kneeling, but Eric Reed was right there next to him as a supporter, and still is. And what he said to me was, you can't police yourselves. When something bad happens, you guys you don't police yourselves. And so that, to me, is the resounding argument that I get from the community, where that's why it is so important for us to come forward to say what's wrong is wrong and be loud about it, because I know that that's a negative viewpoint that the community has on police departments. So when those opportunities, and I hate to call them opportunities, but they are in a way, when you see it, you need to take the opportunity to stand up for what you believe in, so that you can start to kind of, ease the thought that we can't police ourselves.
Were you one of the police officers, though, that went out on the streets with the protesters, and when they asked you to kneel or they asked you to offer some sort of visible gesture of support, did you join? Did you kneel? Did you encourage your officers to do that?
I did not. I did not kneel. I told my officers that's a personal choice if you choose to kneel. I know we did have one of our commanders kneel with a group at one point as well. I was never, so that we did that. Here's one of the things on the kneeling. So I saw a lot of chiefs kneel. I also saw a lot of chiefs kneel that I have not heard or seen them do a single policy or a single thing in their police department that I saw publicly to improve public relationships. I personally just didn't feel that kneeling was something that that showed that I didn't care or that the department didn't care. Now it's a personal choice. And so we did have officers that wanted to make sure they weren't going to get in trouble if they knelt.
Right.
And I said, listen, if you're out there and you want to kneel, as long as it's safe. Well, granted, we were that situation was very chaotic, and it had to be safe, right? You can't have officers kneeling when they're protecting other officers on the line, et cetera, et cetera. But if it was safe to do so, and if particularly you could do so to quell violence, they knew they had my support. I never was marching out there. I wasn't out there particularly at the scene, but they knew they had my support. I remember being asked that officers wanted to know if I would be angry if they knelt, and it was a resounding absolutely not. As long as it's safe, it's a personal choice. But again, I like to think that we want more substance in policing than just simply a gesture of kneeling. I would like to think that we would want, if you looked at the track record we have at the San Jose Police Department with regards to the progressive initiatives that we're doing, I hope that would have meant more than simply making a gesture. But having said that, my officers knew that they were on the front lines. If they were doing that, taking a knee was absolutely not going to be frowned upon by this administration.
All right, I appreciate hearing that. And I just want to follow up on something you said earlier. Yes, I recall the editorials that were printed in newspapers, and some people went on the air and talked about it, radio, television, and on social media. But I'm talking about the human factor of police unions who have a bias against them in some people's eyes for always sticking up for the officer no matter what they do. That was a moment for them to say, we're human first, just like you did. And I don't recall seeing that a lot. Am I wrong about that?
No, you didn't. I mean, obviously, yeah, police unions have their roles, but that may not necessarily been what they said. But you know what? We were trying, and I know our union was the same way. And it's like I say this to you now, having had, months, to process what's occurring, right? I mean, a lot of things we wanted to do, we wanted to move quickly. We wanted to ensure with the violence that was occurring in the protests to really just say that, hey, this department, we stand with you. My message to our protesters as we were dealing with these protests is, we are as angry as you are. We are as angry as you are. No one hates a bad cop more than a good cop. We knew as a profession that what occurred in Minneapolis was going to absolutely drag us back years. We were as angry as our community was. We just wish that the protests would have remained completely peaceful, as opposed to having turned violent because of some agitators that were in crowds, and that caused mistakes on both sides. But again, we were as angry and frustrated as the rest of the country was.
Now, you wanted to bring up the media. I'm happy to engage that. I know you don't have all the world's time, but let's try to talk a little bit about the media coverage. It showed everything from the beginning of the protests after the death of George Floyd, all kinds of reactions of police officers against the people, working with the people, kneeling with the people. You saw an array, but the thing that's riveted in most people's minds are those front lines, police and Black people, along with other cultures, standing together to speak out. That was a powerful message for the nation. It's not just Black people that are angry, it's all of humanity sees this as wrong. And yet the show of force was misperceived, I believe you would say, because I think the image, some people would say, was that you were ready to be hostile. You were not ready to listen. What would you say about that?
I'll tell you what, it's interesting because, but particularly in San Jose in 2016, when we dealt with the Trump rally, we were criticized for not doing enough in that rally. Then you fast forward 2020, and we're criticized for doing too much. We handled a lot of incidents in between that time, protests, rallies of that nature that never turned into what the George Floyd protests turned into. And so we've been criticized, but at the same time, I mean, our response was based on the violence. Now, I will say this, that we're learning from that. And if there's ways that we can de-escalate situations, if there are different tactics that we can use, we will absolutely look at all that. But, you know, our protest started peacefully in San Jose for a few hours and nothing happened. And then cars started getting vandalized, police cars' windows started getting hit, officers start taking bottles and rocks. And so, yes, it was the coverage, even currently, doesn't exactly lend it. Listen, we made mistakes. I'm not going to deny that we've made mistakes. But to say that it was our presence that caused violence is inaccurate, absolutely inaccurate. And as you know, it's interesting now because as you see other cities around the country who have taken a more tolerant approach to this violence, you've seen what's occurred, and it's not positive. And so that is no different than what occurred in San Jose. And although my officers made mistakes, we're not perfect. The vast majority of them held that line and kept this city from burning. And I will forever be grateful and proud of them for that.
Now, I must ask the question that some viewers must be thinking right now. Okay, you had to do what you had to do to keep order. But were the rubber bullets and the things, the projectiles coming from the police into the crowd that hit people, that hit the media, that hit all kinds of people on the sidelines, was that necessary? Why do you have to go that far?
Well, listen, as I make mention, I mean, we're going to have an after action report that dealt with that. But Bob, that was the most chaotic situation and the most violent protest that I've seen in the nearly 30 years that I've been here. And we made mistakes. It was the first time that we've had to deal with something like that. And we're going to correct those mistakes. No, I'm going to tell you, not everything was probably necessary. When I look at the reports, when I look at the internal affairs that happened, there may not be. And so I'm certainly not going to hide behind that. We are not perfect. We made mistakes in one of the most chaotic situations that has ever hit this city. And so we will get better. And I've not denied that from the start. But there was also another side to that, which seems to be missing oftentimes from the reporting. I'm calling it, we made mistakes. Some of the things we did were probably unnecessary. I'm not denying that. Yes, people got hit that probably shouldn't have. Okay, whether it was on purpose or a ricochet or what have you. You know, what's not talked about is we didn't use, we wouldn't have used those techniques without first giving a lawful dispersal order that people didn't follow, which then led to violence because there were agitators that hid behind the protesters that were there peacefully, although they didn't follow the dispersal orders, which then the mistakes happened. But there's a lot to the story that's not been really told.
Right, and that point is well taken, and I don't want to keep you too long because I know you got to get on to other things, but I have to take you to one more area before we finish.
Sure, of course.
After the event, after what happened in Minneapolis, we had weeks of protests and all kinds of activities took place where communities started stand up, speak out, to start marching on police headquarters and city halls. It was interesting to see democracy rise up in front of our eyes. But we also saw the police acting in some places very badly. One journalist I know made reference to the fact, following George Floyd, through the end of July, there were more than 100 incidents where the police and African Americans, Latinos, other people were caught on camera doing the most remarkably weird things. And it made us wonder, did police learn anything from the George Floyd incident shown on international television?
Well, I can only speak for us, for this department. And what I'll say is that we did learn as we went. We evolved. But the protesters evolved as well. It was dual because we had the most violence on the first Friday. Saturday was somewhat violent as well, but it began to calm down. We truly only had 1 or 2 days where necessarily tear gas, the rubber baton, and other techniques were used for those first 2 days. Now, granted, I said what I said with regards to we could do better, and we will, and we made mistakes, but we were also responding to the violence of the agitators that were in a peaceful protest. But we evolved as they evolved as well, because we also had several more protests at City Hall that did not turn violent. We had incidents where officers may have been hit with a bottle or two, but that officers refrained from escalating any further because of the mitigated assault that they undertook. We had people march on the police headquarters and actually just sit down in front of our police administration building peacefully. So as in San Jose, as we, I don't want to say as they evolved, we both evolved as the situation changed. And so it was violent for a couple days in San Jose, and then it really turned into what I would have loved to have seen. Because I'll be honest with you, it's, as you know, and I know people are frustrated with our response and other police departments' response throughout the country to these things, to these incidents. You didn't see police officers use force when people marched on the police department and sat in protest. You didn't see that. You didn't see, police officers using force when people rallied at City Hall and protested without lighting garbage cans on fire and throwing garbage cans at car windows. You didn't see that. So as that evolved, we evolved. And that's what I saw in our city.
Very good. And as I said, the media has some culpability. And here's what I mean. In journalism education, we teach students to be respectful of the authority, especially at the scene of an incident where things could blow up into whatever, to follow the law, to stay out of the way, do not incite. But there are two factors that always come into play with our journalists that I think you have to deal with too. And that's a level of maturity and wisdom to know the difference from trying to get an explosive thing on TV as opposed to telling a truthful story. Let's talk a little bit about maturity. We have issues with that we have to teach students, grow up, face the responsibility of being in that moment. What do you tell your officers about the level of maturity?
They need to be incredibly mature. We in those type of situations, we had a very unfortunate incident with an officer who did not act professionally in the crowd, who made vulgar comments to a protester, and we train that. You are supposed to be stoic in the face of that confrontation, and this particular officer didn't do that, and that's a lack of maturity. And our officers need to be more mature. They need to understand that, no, the game's not fair. Yeah, you know what? You're going to be standing on the line and someone's going to be saying the most vile and vulgar things to you. And you just can't do what your instinct may tell you to do. You got to control that. And so maturity in these type of situations is very, very important. And so as you speak about the media, it's important for the maturity as well about being balanced. I'll tell you this, I know I can't speak enough about it, but to me, there's a lot of coverage. I could watch Damian Trujillo's coverage of Friday over and over and over again. To me, that was the most fair coverage that we received in the entire weeks of the protests. And not fair from a perspective of, the police are doing their jobs or whatever. He was literally in the middle of the chaos, filming the chaos, and it's interesting because other people chose to not, let's ignore what actually Damian Trujillo and his crews have actually videoed, and let's just concentrate on all the negativity surrounding the department. But I mean, that's the maturity that it takes too, right? I have a poster on my wall that says, if you want to make everyone happy, don't be a leader, go sell ice cream. Well, I'll tell you this for your students. If you want to make everyone happy, don't be a journalist. You got to look in the mirror at the end of the day and make sure that you're being balanced. And that may rub some people the wrong way. But to me, that's what Damian represents. And that's what a lot of that. Robert Salonga is another one that represents that. And I think that's really that statement isn't just true for my profession, particularly being a police chief, but journalists as well.
All right, let me brag for a second and say, guess who taught Damien journalism?
Let me guess.
But I take no credit.
I can see where that comes from then.
But
Honestly, I mean,
and I
there's nobody.
honestly, and I don't take credit for his success. He's an exceptional journalist. But I think he would be proud to know that you understood what he was trying to do.
Absolutely. He was literally just reporting facts. And that night, I think if people were to watch his coverage that night, instead of watching some of the others and and what have you, I'm not defending the negative actions of this police department, the things we need to do better. Excuse me. But at least individuals could have seen what these men and women were actually responding to and how it looked Friday early evening.
Very good. And I always teach students, the picture does not tell the whole story. You have to add something to it for balance, accuracy, and truth telling. And if you don't do that, you're just showboating. And that is not good journalism. Chief, I'm going to let it stop at this point, but I'm going to have you back.
I'd love to be back.
I think the country and certainly the Bay Area would benefit from a police officer who has had your experience, who understands what the media wants to hear from an analyst about what is the police thinking when all of these stories come out one by one by one. Is that something you would consider doing?
I'd love to. I would love to see more of that. If I can help, listen, people don't know what they don't know. If I can help bring that balance, and I don't want to say fairness, right? Because sometimes things aren't going to be fair. I'm talking about balance. If I can help bring that balance so that someone can just say, oh, okay, that's why they did it. Or because that balance can work the other way. Like, oh, actually the chief that's been a police officer for nearly 30 years says that doesn't look good. Okay, that doesn't look good. So I'd be balanced and I want to be able to help. If I could help, I'd be all game for that.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I think the media will be too. And a personal note, tell your mother she brought up a very interesting, very intelligent young man who rose to the top. He was number one.
Yeah, she's a very, very proud woman, very proud of her son. I'm proud of her. She's definitely left a legacy.
Thank you, Chief. We appreciate the time today.
Thank you. God bless, and thanks for having me.